Okay, welcome to the video. Sig Guy here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to install the Armory Craft Action Tuning Kit in your Sig Sauer P320. This is a spring kit that Armory Craft put together. It's made up of a bunch of different springs and spring weights. We got trigger bar springs in there, Sear springs in there, Striker safety spring in there. You can either use one of these springs in your 320, or you can use all the different options in your 320. This will reduce your trigger pull anywhere from a half a pound up to 2 pounds in some FCUs. So with that, let's get started. So before we get into the installation, let's talk about what's included in the kit and what are the different options and how do I use those different options. All this stuff is in the description on the website, but there's still a lot of questions that people have. So hopefully this video will clear up a lot of those questions. Now with a tuning kit, Armory Craft obviously has their dual adjustable trigger, which allows you to remove some of the pre-travel and the over-travel as much as you want. You can do a little, you can do a lot. Everybody has their own preference, okay? That's the great thing about a tuning kit, is it makes that pistol shoot the way you want it to shoot, okay? So Armory Craft put together this kit to give you the ability to tune the weight, the trigger pull weight of your P320, okay? So in the kit, we have basically 3 different options. We got trigger bar springs, we got Sear springs, and we got a Striker safety spring, okay? So we have 3 different trigger bar springs, and all these numbers are percentages of the OEM springs that they come from the factory in your P320. So we have a plus 10%, a minus 10%, and a minus 20% trigger bar spring. You can see these trigger bar springs are all laid out evenly here on the bottom, and then the upper leg is at a different angle. So this one down here, which is opened up the most, this is the increased trigger bar spring, plus 10%. We sell a ton of these springs because a lot of people love that more tactile, audible reset, the faster reset in their 320. You can hear it, you can feel it much better. It does increase the trigger pull weight just a little bit. Probably not even going to notice it, but the trade-off for that tactile, more faster, positive reset is completely worth it. So that's included in the kit. And then we have a minus 10% and a minus 20% trigger bar spring, which is going to reduce the amount of trigger pull weight in your P320. Next, we have our reduced power Striker safety spring. This is minus 20% from your factory spring. And on the bottom here, we have 2 sets of Sear springs, okay? We have a longer set and a shorter set. The longer set not only is longer, but you can visually see between the coils there's more spacing than the shorter set, okay? The longer set is reduced power by 25%. And the shorter ones are reduced power by 50% compared to your OEM springs. So that's the different springs in the kit. That's the weights. And the number one question that I get all the time from people is, do I have to use all the springs, meaning the trigger bar spring, the Sear spring, the Sear spring and the Striker safety spring? Do I have to use them all in the kit? The answer is absolutely not. You can either put just the trigger bar spring in it and call it good. You can put just the Striker safety spring in it and call it good. Or you can put a set of Sear springs in it and call it good. You can put 2 springs in it. You can put 3 springs in it. You can do whatever you want to achieve that trigger pull weight that you want in your 320. That's the beauty thing about a tuning kit, and everybody has their personal preference. So that's what's in the kit. Hopefully that answers a lot of questions. Let's move on to the installation portion. Okay, so I'm going to be using this 320. This is one of my newer ones that I just put together, and I'm usually running the Armory Craft trigger in it, but this is one of the newer Sig Sauer P320 FCUs that are all black now, okay? When I did this video, I wanted a completely stock FCU, so that way I wouldn't have to undo adjustment screws and all that stuff to demonstrate the installation. So, as always, when we're working on a firearm, we're going to obviously make sure that it is a safe and clear firearm. So we're going to remove our magazine. We're going to lock our slide to the rear. We're going to physically and visually check to make sure there's no round in the chamber. No magazine. Check our breech face. Look away. Do the same thing again. Chamber, magazine, breech face. We are working on a safe and clear firearm. Next, we're going to remove the FCU from the grip module. So we're going to perform a basic field strip. I'm going to lock my slide to the rear. I'm going to rotate my takedown lever, hang on to my slide, and release it. We'll set that aside right there. We're going to rotate and pull out our takedown lever. And because these new FCUs go in there super tight, I'm going to use my Armor's block to hook onto the front of it there and pull it up and out of my grip module. I do sell these Armor's block from the SIG Armor on my website, sigguy.com. So if you're interested in one of those, these are very handy. So as you can see, we have the all black newer FCU from SIG. This is completely factory, everything in it. And the way that we'll do this video is we'll do one spring at a time for those people that just want to replace that one spring and not do all of them, okay? So we're not going to completely disassemble this thing, put all the different options in there and put it all back together. We'll do one option at a time, and we're going to start with our trigger bar spring. So to remove our trigger bar spring, the way I'm going to show you how to do it, it's not going to damage your trigger bar spring at all, okay, if you do it properly. The number one email I get after people disassemble and reassemble their FCU is their trigger doesn't work properly anymore. It does not reset. Basically, the spring doesn't have enough power to push the trigger all the way forward in order to reset it because they've damaged their trigger bar spring. So a lot of people like to grab the trigger bar spring with a pair of needle nose and get it unhooked from the FCU. Some people like to push it to the side like this. That's just going to distort your spring if you're not careful, okay? So the way I'm going to show you how to do it, we're going to actually work in the reverse option. We're going to remove our trigger, then our trigger bar, then our trigger bar spring, versus do the spring first, then the trigger bar, then the trigger, okay? So all we're going to do is we're going to grab onto our trigger bar here, and we're going to free it from our Sear housing. This is our Sear housing right here, okay? This black piece of metal made to my FCU. You can see how my trigger bar bends at a 90-degree angle and goes into the Sear housing. Basically, I'm going to lift my trigger bar up towards me, out, and bring it around the side of the Sear housing as far as I can. Depending on which trigger you have in it, not all triggers allow this trigger bar to come back as far as others. Some you can get the trigger bar all the way around the back side and lay against the Sear housing. Some you can just barely get out and it rests right on the edge here like the SIG one. And I'll show you why here in a second. So I'm going to grab onto my trigger bar. I'm going to pull it up, out, and bring it towards the rear as much as possible. And you can see how it's just resting on the edge of my Sear housing right here. Ideally, I would love this thing to come around the back side of it and rest against the back side of my Sear housing like the Armory craft trigger does and a lot of other ones. The reason why it doesn't is because this trigger can't go any further forward because of this piece they put on the bottom of it here, made part of the trigger. It's contacting the FCU, so it won't allow me to pivot that trigger anymore. I don't know why they put that on there, but it is what it is. So compared to other triggers, this one's a little bit more difficult to remove and install versus most of the other aftermarket triggers. So now that we have that out as much as possible like that, our trigger is in this top part is in the rearward position the most. Now we can just slide that trigger straight up and out of our FCU, just like that. Now that we have our trigger removed, we're just going to grab onto our trigger bar and rotate it counterclockwise up and around the back. And then we're just going to make sure we go out far enough to clear our slide catch here. So we're going to rotate it just like that. Make sure we're unhooked. The back portion there likes to get caught up. Just going to rotate it all the way out like that. Then we're going to unhook it from our FCU. Then we just take our spring and remove it from our trigger bar. One thing I want to mention while we're at this point, if it hasn't happened to you already, there might have been a piece that fell out of your FCU, and it's very common, and if it happens, it's no big deal. What I'm talking about is your safety lever pivot pin. It's this pin right here. The other side of it is right here. And it is just a loose fit through the FCU, and the only thing that keeps it actually from falling out is your grip module. So as we have this installed in our grip module, you can see that pin is retained by the side of our grip module right there. Okay. So anytime this is outside of our FCU, if you have it upside down like this, a lot of times gravity just makes that pin fall straight out. Now, this is a newer FCU. There's all kinds of coating stuff in all the holes and everything's pretty tight for the most part. But on probably 90% of my FCUs, anytime I have it out of the grip module, that pin will fall out of there. So if that happens, it's no big deal. You can either put it back right now, or you can wait till after you get your trigger bar, and your trigger bar spring in. That way it doesn't fall out on you again. Either way is fine. So I'm going to show you how to put that back in. These are one of my toolkits. This is one of my toolkits I offer on sigguy.com. This is the deluxe one with all the different toolkits combined into one kit. And these have slave pins to line up all the components in your FCU to make it easier to get the pins through. So in this kit, we have the large alignment pin right here, which is the same exact hole as the hole right there. So I'm going to use a smaller pin right now to push that out. So say yours fell out just like that. That's our safety lever pivot pin. Okay, and I sell a ton of these. I have these on the website. I'm currently out of stock, but normally I have a ton of these in stock, and that's one of my #1 sellers. So I'm not sure if it's people converting from manual safety to non-safety, which you would need to get a new one of these, or it's people that have lost their safety lever by falling out on accident. Either way, these are available, sigguy.com. So all we got to do is line up our safety lever, which is this guy right here. Got to line up our hole all the way through it. Okay, so we're going to use our pin alignment tool here. I'm just going to work it so that it goes through all the way. And this is a newer FCU, so the tolerances are pretty tight. But that pin fits perfectly through that hole. Very snug fit. So now my safety lever is orientated perfectly with the holes. And it's much easier to get something to go through there with a bigger handle on it. That's why we have these alignment tools with the big handle on them. So now we're going to insert our pin through. This is the left side of your FCU right here, okay, as if you're shooting forward. So it goes through the left side. We're just basically going to use this to push our slave pin out. I'm going to get it started just like that. And push it right through our hole until we're perfectly flush over here. We're perfectly flush over here. We can actually do a little check to make sure that pivots freely, which it does. So again, these toolkits are available on sigguy.com. There's a couple different sizes in the deluxe kit as well as the 320 kit. The medium one is for the other pin right here, and the small one in the kit is for your pin right here in the front. Okay, so you can either get the 320 kit or the deluxe kit for the Sig Sauer P320. But that's how you get that pin back in there. If it falls out, no big deal. Let's move on to reassembling our trigger bar, our trigger, and our trigger bar spring. So moving right along, we're going to use the plus 10% spring. So we're going to grab our trigger bar and our spring. And we're going to take this leg here on our trigger bar spring. We're going to put it through the hole right here on our trigger bar. And if your trigger bar looks a little different than this, this is the newer style trigger bar from Sig. They had a bigger one on here because there were no manual safeties at the time, where they had to redesign the trigger bar because it was interfering with the manual safety lever on your FCU. So this is pretty much the standard trigger bar now for both models, standard with safety and non-safety. So again, if yours is an older one, it looks a little different. Everything is, the procedure is completely the same, okay? So I got it hooked through my trigger bar. I'm going to pinch it with my finger so it doesn't fall out of there. Then we're going to take the hook on our trigger bar spring. We're going to go through the back side of our FCU just like that. And I'm going to rotate this clockwise up and around. We're going to make sure it goes outside of our slide catch. We're going to make sure that the back portion of our trigger bar is outside of the Sear housing. And we're just going to keep rotating it around, bringing it forward. So basically my trigger bar is up against the back of my Sear housing almost. And this portion of my trigger bar is flush on this portion of my FCU, okay? If you look down from the top, you can see there's a little hump here, and then a little downslope, and then this portion here. We want it flat against this portion here, not up here, not on the hump there, down on the lower portion, just like that. Next, we're going to install our trigger shoe. Now, this is a good time to lube up your trigger shoe or do any cleaning as well, okay? If you haven't done maintenance in a while, now would be a great time to actually do some cleaning before you put all this back together. The key lubrication points on our trigger are this post right here. That post right there goes through the hole in our trigger bar. So put a little dab of grease there, a little dab of grease on this pivot point here, and on the inside, those contact our FCU here and through that hole. A little bit of grease on the side of our FCU here where our trigger bar is going to rub against it. And if you have an older style trigger bar that comes up the side here, a little bit of grease back here as well, okay? So once you have that all lubed up and everything, we're going to install our trigger. Now our trigger, the SIG one's a little bit more difficult than everybody else's, as we've already explained, because you don't have as much movement as a lot of the other aftermarket triggers. But to install our trigger, it's got to be basically all the way in the forward position. Slide it straight down in that hole, okay? It can't go in like this. It can't go in like that. It can't go in partially forward. It's got to be all the way forward so you can slide it down in between the notch on this side here. So now we're going to have to line up our hole in our trigger bar with the post on our trigger. And as you can see, our SIG trigger does not go back very far. So we got to bring our trigger bar forward to get it to attach to our trigger. You can see our trigger bar is almost already hitting our Sear here. So it's not going to go much further forward unless we move it out to the side and forward, okay? So we're going to have to move this out to the side a little bit and bring it forward as we're lining up that hole with the pin on our trigger. So I basically grab my trigger, grab it like this, pinch it from the side, okay? And I'm going to grab my trigger bar and fish it around underneath my trigger, pulling out towards me so it can go onto that pin. At the same time, oops, we're already through the hole. At the same time, you're going to be watching this pin right here. It needs to be straight with that hole in order to push your trigger all the way in. Okay, a lot of times people can't get their trigger all the way in because this pin is not lined up through that hole. So it's a lot of things going on at once. Just be patient with it and take your time. Once you've done it a couple times, it's pretty easy, okay? So we're going to move our trigger bar around. And you can see I've hooked it on the back side of my trigger. Okay, but my trigger, I'm squeezing it right now. It won't go into that hole because my pin is not lined up. So if I move the trigger with my finger, I don't want it to fall off that post, just like that. You can see it drop down and went into the hole, okay? So now you can see the gap is closed up and it's sandwiching that trigger bar in between the trigger and the FCU. That's what you need, okay? You're on the home stretch. Now, without letting go, I just use my finger to push back on my trigger and guide my trigger bar out and around and back into that Sear housing. Just like that. Okay? So make sure your trigger bar back here is all the way against your FCU. And that's why you're going to lube it up there a little bit as well, because it's going to rub there. But make sure that's all the way in there like that. Make sure we're through the hole and flush over here. Make sure our trigger bar is attached to our trigger on the pin. Next, we're going to show you how to remove and replace your Sear springs. Your Sear springs are, this is your Sear right here, this silver portion. And you can see when I push down on it, it's spring loaded because there are springs underneath it, which you can kind of see right there. So basically we need to rotate our Sear up to expose our Sear springs, and then we can change out our Sear springs and put it back together. Now you don't have to remove, or excuse me, you don't have to disassemble your entire FCU to change these springs, but If you have not cleaned your FCU in quite some time and it's disgusting, then now would be a great excuse to get in there, disassemble everything, clean everything, put it all back together. If that's something you want to tackle, I do have videos on my YouTube, SIG Guy, showing you how to disassemble and reassemble just about all the SIG Sauer firearms. If it's not something you plan on or you feel comfortable doing, your gunsmith can take care of it, or just kind of give it a brushing or whatever to clean it up a little bit. Anyway, so there's a couple things we need to do here to get our Sear to rotate up. There are several different things that it interacts with. One is our trigger bar, okay? So we need to get our trigger bar away from our Sear. Our safety lever pivot pin that we already showed you how to replace if it fell out by itself on accident, we need to remove that. And our takedown safety lever bar here, we need to pull out a little bit as well, okay? So like we did with our trigger bar spring replacement, we're just going to grab our trigger bar here, we're going to pull it up, out, and around and kind of move it back as far as we can. And as you can see, it's just kind of resting there on the Sear housing, which is fine. Now it's away from our Sear. Just be careful of this portion here. It doesn't come apart, then you have to reassemble all that again. Next, I'm going to actually use my pin alignment tool here, and I'm going to push my safety lever pivot pin out, just like that. So now that pin goes through our Sear as well, but because now we removed that pin, and then there's just the one pin, this is our Sear pivot pin right here, we're going to leave that in. That's actually what our Sear is going to hinge on, and it will be able to move now that we've removed that pin, our safety lever pivot pin. So when we go over to this side here, we basically just need to pull our takedown safety lever bar out a little bit, and you can see there's a leg that comes off the side of it and goes into this cavity here where you can see the spring. That spring is pushing against the leg that comes off of our trigger bar, or our takedown safety lever. Okay, so our takedown safety lever, the leg goes in there like that, and the spring is pushing right up against it. It's a pretty long leg, so we can pull it out just enough like that to where the spring isn't gonna, fall down inside or anything like that. There's plenty of forgiveness in there just to pull that out a little bit, enough for this end to clear our Sear, and then our Sear will rotate up. So you'll see what I'm talking about here in 1 second. I'm going to put my finger over my Sear so it doesn't come flying up as I pull out on my takedown safety. See how that kind of relieved that pressure and came up a little bit? So then we can use our pick. We can just kind of start rotating that up. So right up and out of there just like that. And we can actually let our takedown safety lever fall back into place. And now you can see we have complete access to those Sear springs. Okay. Our Sear springs are just on two posts that are made part of the Sear. It's kind of like a little press fit. So if you grab one of the springs, you can hear it disengage from that post. Grab your other spring. Same thing. Now my hands were a little bit dirty earlier because I completely disassembled this, clean all the lube and stuff out of there, all the grease. That way it's a little easier to make the video, but normally you'll have globs of grease on these posts. For one, if your springs don't click on there, it actually holds them, kind of like glues them there temporarily, and makes it easier when you're putting the springs back down into the two cavities that they sit in. So there's a cavity here on this side, and a cavity on this side. You can see there's a little portion sticking out that divides the two. So when we put our springs back on there, make sure one spring goes down this side, one spring goes down this side. Okay. So if you need to put a little grease on there to put your springs back on to hold it, that's great. This one here, they're actually clicking on there. You can hear it and feel it. I'm just going to put the same springs back in it. That way this is all original. You can use whatever Armory craft springs you choose, either the minus 25% or the minus 50%. So we'll just take the spring and we'll push it back on here, just like that. Do the same thing to this other one. Just like that. And we're going to make sure that they're like this, they're not like this, or squished into each other where the coils are caught on each other. So that way when we start to now I can't rotate this. I can feel it hitting my takedown safety. So we got to pull that back out a little bit. You see how that just fell down by itself? And we're going to guide those springs into the two cavities, just like that. And then we're going to push our Sear down completely. And then I push my trigger bar back in. We'll push our takedown safety lever back in just like that. Now that we have our takedown safety all in, we're going to put our trigger bar back in its normal position. You can see how it's still basically hanging up there. It's not against my FCU. So the same way as we installed it before, I'm basically just going to push on the trigger with my finger here as I guide that trigger bar around and drop it into the Sear housing. Okay. And then lastly, we'll reinstall our safety lever pivot pin. I'll take my alignment pin. I'm going to put it straight through that hole and line up my safety lever. Just like that. So it's gone through my safety lever, it's gone through my Sear, and it's come out the other side. We're going to use that as a slave pin. Basically, I'll take my factory pin and push out my slave pin. Just like that. Okay. Make sure we're perfectly flush over here. And everything works normally. And the last spring in our kit is our striker safety spring. So we're going to show you how to replace that. In order to replace that, we got to remove our striker assembly from our slide. So we're going to remove our guide rod and guide rod spring. We're going to remove our barrel. And we're going to remove our back plate. To remove our back plate, we got to push in on this pin here. This is called our extractor pin plus. It is spring loaded. So we'll push that in a little bit and we'll slide our back plate down. And then when we release that, it'll protrude a little bit. We can remove our back plate and then slide our striker out just like that. Now is a good time if you've never cleaned your striker cavity to clean the striker cavity out, okay? You can use whatever you want. You can use solvents, you can use bore brushes, Q-tips, patches, whatever. Just as long as in the end it is completely bone dry. No oil in there. You don't want to lube it up or anything like that. The same thing with your striker. It needs to be completely dry. Cavities completely dry. You can actually see the hole in the bottom there where the striker goes through there. Make sure that's all nice and cleaned out. And if your extractor fell out or whatever, now's a good time to clean that, as well as the retaining assembly. We'll pull that out. Our extractor falls right out the side. Okay, we can make sure it's nice and sharp, or it's going to catch our brass and pull it out of the chamber. Make sure it's all free of carbon. This only goes in one way, just like that. And then you can see this little window behind it. When we install our pin here, that little leg actually captures our extractor. So it goes in just like this. Okay, where that protrusion part here is facing outwards. So if it's like this, it needs to be facing upwards. Anyway, when you push this in here, you can look through that little hole. You can see that little protrusion there capturing the extractor. If it's rotated incorrectly and you go to push it in, no matter what you do, you won't see that in the window. Okay, so you got to make sure that this is rotated properly, or it's catching your extractor. So now we're going to remove the striker safety spring, which is located right here. This little guy right here, shaped like a V, wraps around this post and then goes this way. Now, if you lose this spring, obviously you have the Armory Craft one, but if you do lose this spring and you don't have a replacement spring for it, you're going to have to buy a whole new striker, because I don't think you can get just the striker safety spring other than in the Armory Craft kit. And the striker is going to run you about $50. Okay, so be very careful. I'm telling you this from experience. Okay, so basically I would recommend maybe putting this in a big Ziploc bag, like we've done some of our mag release springs before. That way if it comes shooting out of there, at least the bag will capture it, hopefully, and you won't lose it. So normally people are going to want to undo one of these legs here, which that's the way I used to do it in the past. It's much easier just to kind of cover the whole spring and just leave that portion that goes over the post exposed, and then use your pick to get it off of that post, just like that. And be very careful because it can still be under spring tension. Just kind of lift it upside down and let it fall out right into your hand, just like that. Okay. Next, we'll reinstall the Armory Craft reduced power 20% striker safety spring. That's the one on the right here. The factory one is on the left. You can see the wire size is just a little bit smaller. And this is gonna, again, it's gonna reduce the trigger pull weight in your P320. So we're gonna install that one. And again, very cautious with this. Obviously the Armory Craft one, it's cheap enough to get another kit. But if you want the OEM spring, if you're doing this and putting the OEM one back in, and you lose that OEM spring, well, it's an expensive little spring because you got to buy a whole new striker, okay? So the way that I usually do this is I'm going to position it so that the shorter leg, I love how that just fell right down onto there into place. Couldn't do that again if I tried. Anyway, I got the shorter leg in place. I got the loop around the post there. So I'm going to pinch that with my fingers. I'm going to make sure that that short leg is captured. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to swing that other longer leg down along this lever here until it falls off the edge of that lever, and it'll go right up underneath it. Okay, you'll actually kind of hear it click. Hear that click? So carefully I'll remove my fingers so I can inspect it. And then you can see it's underneath the shelf here where it needs to be. And it's down along the bottom where it needs to be. So I'm going to still hang on to it, and I can push my striker in a little bit, and I can exercise that lever. You got to depress your striker just a little bit, and you can push that lever in and out and make sure that spring is going to stay in there and it's captured and everything is good to go. And there you go. If you haven't lost the spring, it's just that easy to switch it out. Now all we have to do is reinstall our striker, make sure your extractor's in there with the components that hold it. We'll slide our striker in there like so. We'll push it in just a little bit. And by the way, make sure that channel is completely bone dry, okay? I did have a guy ask me today about REM dry lube. I have used REM dry lube in the past. Basically, you spray it on, it all evaporates off, and it leaves like a Teflon slick finish on the striker. I've used it in the past. I've never had any problems, but the thought behind it being bone dry is it's not going to collect anything, okay? Like all your gunpowder and the residue and carbon and whatever else can get through the hole there, the striker hole in the front, will actually stick to the whatever's on your striker or the channel and prevent that striker from moving nice and freely. So that's the whole thought behind it. Like I said, I've used REM dry lube. I didn't have a problem with it, but I do pretty frequent cleanings of my 320, so just keep that in mind. So I just kind of pressed my striker in, put my slide cap on halfway, and then I'm going to use my nylon punch here to push in on the extractor pin there, slide up my cap, release my pin, make sure it's all locked into place, and there you go. And that's just how easy it is to install the Armory Craft Action Tuning Kit for your Sig Sauer P320. Anytime we disassemble and reassemble any firearm, we want to do a function check afterwards. So we're going to perform the Sig Sauer function check on the P320, and this is straight from the manual. So step one, with the slide forward, insert a magazine into the 320 and ensure it locks into place by pulling downward on the magazine. So we're going to install our magazine and give it a couple tugs there, make sure it fits nice and securely. Retract the slide to the rear while the empty magazine is in place. The slide should lock to the rear as the follower pushes the slide catch lever upwards. So this is going to simulate a last round in your magazine. Our slide catch lever should get pushed up and get into this little notch right there. So we'll slide it back. It locks it into place, so that part passes. The magazine catch is then pressed, and the magazine should fall free from the grip module under its own weight. Okay. This verifies the correct relationship of the magazine and the magazine catch. We didn't take that apart, but we want to make sure that everything fits properly. And if you're adding a mag well or a base pad or even a new magazine, you just want to make sure that it's going to perform properly and fall out under its own weight. Okay. So we'll remove our magazine. We'll pull the slide slightly rearward. Watch to see the slide catch lever drop from the arresting notch of the slide, which it does, and then release the slide. So now we're going to be pulling the trigger, but we want to make sure that we are still working on a clear and safe firearm, as we did have a magazine in it, and a lot of people like to have loaded magazines laying around on their bench. So we are free in our chamber, no magazine, our breech face, look away, do the same thing, chamber, magazine, breech face, so everything is good to go, okay? So we're going to press and hold the trigger to the rear. The striker should release, which it does. With the trigger still held to the rear, retract and release the slide. As you release the trigger, you will feel and hear the Sear reset. Pretty long trigger with that factory trigger. So if you don't have an Armory Craft dual adjustable trigger in there, you're missing out. And then with the trigger, we already did that. Retract the slide approximately 10 millimeters or until the barrel hood drops out of the slide. When the trigger is pressed, the striker should not release. So we're going to take it out of battery, pull our trigger, and our striker does not release. The ultimate function test is to live fire the pistol. So as the manual indicates, this did pass the function check, but it also says the ultimate function check is to live fire the pistol yourself. So anytime we make any changes or even disassemble and reassemble any firearm, we want to bring a couple boxes of ammo to the range and run it through there and make sure everything is 100% functional. You are the ultimate final say whether that pistol should be returned to service or not after it's been disassembled and reassembled or modified in any way, okay? You can't blame anybody else for somebody else doing something. It's your firearm. You got to take the responsibility to making sure it's 100% safe. So if you enjoy this type of video, I appreciate you watching, and there should be a subscribe button right down here in the corner. If you could smash that, baby, I'd really appreciate it. And if you're interested in any Sig Sauer upgrades, I have tons of upgrades from many different manufacturers on sigguy.com. As always, thank you for watching and have a good day.